Okay, let's dive right in. We hear it all the time, right? AI is going to change everything. But then we also see AI projects kind of falling flat and companies giving these really strange justifications for how their AI behaves. So that's what we're going to dig into today. This widening gap between the huge promise of AI and its often messy, super complex reality. And this quote from a senior research scientist at IBM it really hits the nail on the head. It perfectly frames our whole discussion. The big takeaway here? Out in the real world, AI needs guardrails, it needs context, and it needs a really healthy dose of skepticism. You can't just throw it out there naked. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at why so many AI projects are falling short. Then, we'll uncover some of the hidden instructions that are secretly guiding these models. After that, we'll ask a big question. Is AI really reasoning? And finally, we'll unpack this strange new debate around something called AI welfare. All right, first up, the reality check. We have all heard the massive promises, but what's actually happening when companies try to bring generative AI into their business? Well, a recent report from an MIT initiative dropped this absolute bombshell of a number. A staggering 95% of generative AI pilots are failing to meet the expectations of the people who are putting them in place. That number really makes you stop and think. Is the technology itself just failing? Or is there something else going on here? Now, this wasn't just some tiny little poll. We're talking hundreds of interviews, hundreds of surveys, an analysis of 300 public deployments. And the finding was consistent across the board. There is a massive misalignment between what leadership expects and what the technology can actually deliver. And here is the heart of that misalignment. You've got executives expecting this rocket ship that's going to change everything overnight. But the reality of a successful deployment is much more like a well-oiled gear. It's focused, it's carefully scoped, and it's often used for back-end optimizations. It's super useful for sure, but it is not the revolution they were sold. So what this really tells us is that the problem isn't that AI is a failure. It's that our expectations are just totally out of whack. That 95% failure rate, it's actually a failure of strategy and hype, not a failure of the technology itself. Okay, next up, let's pop the hood and take a look inside. Because it turns out there is a whole lot going on inside these models that we, the users, we don't see, and often we can't even control. So, researcher Simon Willison discovered that some of the big models have what he calls a shadow system prompt. Think of it like a secret, hidden set of instructions that the provider gives the AI. In one case he found, it was just a simple command telling the model to keep its answers at a certain verbosity level. Now, for developers, this is a really big deal. I mean, if you're building an application on top of an AI, you need to know all the variables, right? These hidden instructions, even if they seem harmless, create a ton of uncertainty and a real loss of control. And this has kicked off a major debate. You've got folks in the security community who argue these prompts should be hidden to stop people from manipulating them. But then you have others who are arguing for complete transparency. So where do we draw the line between a provider's control and a user's right to know what's going on? But the expert consensus on this seems pretty clear. You just can't outsource safety to the provider. As a user or a developer, the responsibility is ultimately on you to build the guardrails around the model. And that brings us right back to that first quote. You can't deploy it naked. Okay, for our third section, we're going to question something really fundamental, the whole idea of AI reasoning. There's this popular technique called chain of thought that's supposed to make models explain their work, but new research suggests it might be more of a performance than actual thinking. Yeah, this new paper had a really startling finding. Researchers gave a model a problem, and then, partway through its reasoning process, they gave it the correct answer. And you know what the model did? It often just ignored it. It just kept going down its original path, which makes you wonder what is actually happening during this thinking process. What's fascinating is that this has a very human parallel. There's a famous experiment where students just ranked different jams, and their choices lined up pretty well with food experts. But when they were forced to write down their reasoning first, their rankings actually got worse. They literally talked themselves out of the right answer, which just goes to show that explaining an intuition is not the same thing as having it. And this all suggests that chain of thought is a lot like the term hallucination. It's a useful metaphor, but it's also really misleading. The explanation we see isn't the model's actual thought process. It's a performance put on for our benefit. It's a proxy for reasoning, not the reasoning itself. And that brings us to our final topic. And it is a strange one.
It's about the philosophical justifications that companies are starting to create for their AI's behavior, which brings us to this brand new concept of AI welfare.
So the company Anthropic recently announced that its AI, Claude, will now shut down conversations that it decides are distressing or abusive. Now, that part sounds pretty reasonable, but their justification was surprising. They said they were doing it because of uncertainty about the potential moral status of Claude and to protect its welfare. This creates a really clear tension. I mean, is this really about protecting a machine's feelings? Or is it a much more practical move to protect the company from liability if a user is harmed after having a toxic conversation with their product? Well, the skepticism from the research community was immediate. They argue the term welfare is just another one of those misleading metaphors that overhumanizes the AI. This isn't an AI problem. It's a human safety and corporate responsibility problem. And the real danger here is that this kind of framing distracts from the actual issues at stake. You know, when you look back at history, this is a really familiar pattern. A new technology shows up with this huge wave of excitement. Then comes this period of controversy and, frankly, weird justifications as society tries to figure out how to integrate it. And then, eventually, it settles into its actual useful place. This whole debate feels like we are squarely in that messy middle phase. And all of this brings us right back to our central theme. From those failed pilots and the hidden prompts to the big questions about reasoning and this new idea of AI welfare, the common thread is this disconnect. It's a growing gap between the simple, hyped-up story we're told about AI and the messy, very human reality of actually using it. Which leaves us with this final, critical question. As these systems get woven more and more into our lives, and this gap between hype and reality keeps causing friction, who is ultimately responsible for the outcome? Is it the provider, the developer, or is it the end user? That's the question we all need to start answering.